In the 4th century, on the dusty roads of North Africa, Roman travelers began to report something disturbing. Groups of men armed with wooden clubs stopped entire caravans, not to rob, but to demand something impossible to understand. They wanted to be killed. They shouted in Latin and Punic, challenging travelers to make them martyrs. When refused, they attacked first, forcing a fatal reaction. They were the Circumcellions, and their existence defied everything Rome knew about religion, sanity, and human nature itself. The Roman Empire had faced rebellions, strange cults, and apocalyptic sects, but it had never encountered a religious movement whose central goal was mass self-destruction. The Circumcellions didn't want to convert the world. They didn't seek political power or riches. They wanted to die. And they believed, with absolute conviction, that this death would lead them directly to paradise. They weren't ordinary suicides. They were warriors of faith who turned martyrdom into a weapon, a strategy, an identity. Before we continue, I need to tell you something important. If you've made it this far, it's because you aren't satisfied with simplified versions of history. This channel exists to unearth truths that have been buried, forgotten, or distorted for centuries. If you want to understand Christianity without filters, without romanticism, but with all the complexity and tension it really had, subscribe now. Because what you're about to discover in the next few minutes will challenge everything you thought you knew about faith, martyrdom, and religious madness. The Circumcellions emerged in one of the most chaotic periods of Christian history. The Roman Empire had just legalized Christianity under Constantine in 313 AD, but the promised peace never arrived. On the contrary, Christians began to fight among themselves with a violence that rivaled the ancient Roman persecutions. In North Africa, especially in the provinces of Numidia and Mauritania, this internal war took on terrifying proportions. And at the center of this storm were they, men who called themselves soldiers of Christ, but who terrorized even other Christians. The name Circumcellions comes from the Latin Circumcellions, meaning those who circle the celli, the grain storehouses. They were, for the most part, rural workers, poor peasants, freed slaves, and the dispossessed. They lived on the margins of Roman society, in a region where exploitation was brutal and hope was scarce. But something happened in that arid, forgotten land. Something that transformed despair into fanaticism, and fanaticism into one of the most extreme religious manifestations the ancient world ever witnessed. To understand the Circumcellions, you need to feel Roman Africa in the 4th century. Not the Africa of philosophers and the academies of Alexandria. Not the Africa of mosaics and the luxurious villas of Carthage. We are talking about the brutal interior, the plains of Numidia, where the sun cracked the earth and life was measured in harvests and debts. Here, the Roman Empire was an extraction machine. Grain, olive oil, taxes, everything flowed to Rome, and what was left barely fed those who produced it. The rural population of this region was majority Berber, descendants of the ancient Carthaginians and native peoples of North Africa. They spoke Punic and Latin, but their cultural roots were profoundly different from Rome's. When Christianity arrived in the 2nd century, it found fertile ground, but not the polished Christianity of the urban basilicas. What flourished here was an intense, emotional, apocalyptic faith. A faith that saw the world as a battlefield between God and the devil, between purity and corruption. This region also had a long tradition of resistance. Centuries earlier, Carthage had challenged Rome in bloody wars. The memory of the destruction of Carthage in 146 BC still echoed. The Berbers were never completely Romanized. They kept their languages, their customs, their pride. And when Christianity offered them a new identity, that of a chosen people, warriors of faith, they embraced it with fervor. But the Christianity that reached them was not uniform. There were deep theological disputes, especially regarding the nature of the church and the meaning of martyrdom. During Roman persecutions, many Christians had been tortured and killed. They were venerated as heroes, saints, supreme examples of faith. But other Christians had caved. They handed over sacred scriptures, denied the faith, collaborated with Rome to save their lives. When the persecution ended, the devastating question arose: What to do with the traitors? In Roman Africa, this question became an open wound. A bishop named Donatus led a movement demanding absolute purity. For the Donatists, the church had to be immaculate, composed only of saints. Bishops who had betrayed during the persecution had no authority. Sacraments administered by them were invalid. The official church, supported by Rome and the emperor, disagreed. It said the validity of sacraments did not depend on the priest's holiness, but on God's power. This divergence seemed technical, theological, but in North Africa, it turned into civil war. The Donatist schism was not just a theological dispute. It was a cultural, social, and political rupture that divided African Christianity for over a century. On one side, the Catholic Church, supported by the empire, wealthy landowners, and urban bishops. On the other, the Donatist Church, rooted in the countryside, among the poor, among those who saw themselves as the true heirs of the martyrs. And at the heart of this Donatist church, as its most radical wing, were the Circumcellions. Donatus, the leader who gave the movement its name, was a man of unshakable convictions. He argued that the church should be holy, separate from the world, incorruptible. For him, the alliance between church and empire, which had begun with Constantine, was a betrayal. The church was becoming worldly, political, contaminated. The Donatists saw themselves as the faithful remnant, the true church, while the Catholics were apostates in disguise. This vision had special appeal among the poor. For a Numidian peasant, exploited by Roman landlords, the Catholic Church seemed complicit in oppression. Its bishops lived in cities, spoke refined Latin, dined with magistrates. The Donatist bishops, however, were seen as men of the people, defenders of the weak, heirs of the martyrs. Donatism became, in many respects, a movement of cultural and social resistance as much as religious. But there was a problem. Donatism, with its emphasis on purity and martyrdom, created a culture of extremism. If the greatest honor was to die for the faith, then living was, in a way, a failure. If the church was to be pure, then any compromise was treason. This relentless logic generated a generation of believers who did not fear death. On the contrary, they desired it. And among these believers, the most radical formed the Circumcellions. The Circumcellions were not clergy. They were not theologians. They were rural workers, men and women, yes. There were women among them who took Donatist theology to its most extreme conclusions. If martyrdom was the path to heaven, why wait? If the world was corrupt and the Catholic Church was false, why not fight? They organized themselves into bands, armed with wooden clubs they called Israelites. They roamed the roads, attacked Catholic properties, freed slaves, burned debt records, and they sought, above all, glorious death. What made the Circumcellions truly unique was not the violence. The ancient world was full of violence. It was the motivation. They didn't fight to win. They fought to die. And this complete inversion of military and political logic left Romans and Christians equally perplexed. How do you fight an enemy who wants to be defeated? How do you threaten someone with death when death is exactly what they seek? The theology behind this behavior was, in its own twisted logic, coherent. The Circumcellions believed that martyrdom wiped away all sins instantly. A martyr needed no penance, would not pass through purgatory, a concept not yet fully developed, but the idea of post-death purification existed, would face no judgment. They went straight to paradise, crowned as a hero of the faith. This belief wasn't their invention. It was rooted in centuries of Christian tradition that venerated martyrs above all other saints. But the Circumcellions took it a step further. If martyrdom was so valuable, why wait for persecution? Why not provoke it? Why not force someone to kill you? This logic led them to behaviors that shocked even other Donatists. They stopped travelers on the roads and demanded, "Kill me, or I'll kill you." If the traveler refused, they attacked, forcing a lethal response. If the traveler killed them, they died happy, singing hymns. There are reports of Circumcellions throwing themselves off cliffs, voluntarily drowning, or throwing themselves into fires. But these methods were considered less honorable. True martyrdom, the most valuable kind, was that inflicted by a persecutor. That is why they provoked Roman authorities, attacked soldiers, invaded Catholic churches. They wanted to be arrested, tortured, executed. And when that happened, their communities celebrated them as saints. The Catholic Church was horrified. Saint Augustine, the great theologian who lived in Africa during the height of the Circumcellion movement, wrote extensively against them. He argued that suicide was a sin, that provoking one's own death was the same as suicide, that true martyrdom required unjust persecution, not intentional provocation. But to the Circumcellions, Augustine was just another traitor, an urban intellectual who had sold the faith to the empire. Now, I need to pause for a moment. If you are watching this far, it's because this story has captured you, and there is much more to discover. But let me ask you a question. How many times have you heard about the Circumcellions in church, in school, anywhere? Probably never. Why? Because this story is uncomfortable. It challenges simple narratives about faith and madness, about martyrdom and fanaticism. If you want to keep unearthing these hidden truths, subscribe now and hit the notification bell. Because there is a lot more forbidden history coming. The roads of North Africa in the 4th century were vital arteries of the empire. Through them flowed grain, oil, wine, slaves, soldiers, merchants. But as the century progressed, these roads became dangerous in a way Rome had never faced. Bands of Circumcellions patrolled the trade routes, not as common bandits, but as religious guerrillas. And their tactics were as disconcerting as their motivations. A Catholic merchant traveling from Carthage to Hippo might be stopped by a group of men dressed in simple tunics, armed with clubs. They didn't ask for money. They asked about his faith. If he was Catholic, he was considered an enemy. If he was Donatist, he might pass, but perhaps be recruited. If he resisted, he was beaten. If he killed one of them in self-defense, the others fled, but returned to venerate the body of the fallen martyr. The Circumcellions developed a particularly cruel tactic against Catholic landowners. They invaded farms, freed slaves, destroyed debt documents, burned barns. But the goal was not theft or redistribution. It was religious punishment. They saw Catholic landlords as spiritual and economic oppressors. Freeing slaves was an act of divine justice. Destroying property was purification. There is a particularly disturbing account of a Catholic bishop who was kidnapped by Circumcellions. They dragged him to a remote area, beat him brutally, and blinded him with a mixture of lime and vinegar in his eyes. They didn't kill him. They wanted him to live as a testament to their power, as a warning. This type of ritualized violence, charged with religious symbolism, terrorized Catholic communities. But the Circumcellions were not just destructive. Within their own Donatist communities, they were seen as protectors. They defended poor villages against abusive tax collectors. They protected peasants from violent landowners. They functioned as a kind of religious and social police, applying a brutal justice, but one that resonated with the dispossessed. To the poor of Numidia, the Circumcellions were heroes. To Rome and the Catholic Church, they were terrorists. The empire tried to suppress them with military force. Detachments of soldiers were sent to hunt the bands. But the Circumcellions knew the terrain, had local support, and crucially, did not fear death. Battles against them were frustrating. They attacked with suicidal ferocity, absorbed casualties that would break any normal army, and when defeated, died singing. How do you defeat an enemy like that? One of the most disturbing and least known aspects of the Circumcellions is that they were not just men. Women also participated, and in ways that shocked Roman society even more. There were reports of women throwing themselves off cliffs in groups, of mothers taking children to be martyred, of entire families seeking collective death as a path to salvation. Ancient historiography, written by enemies of the Circumcellions, tends to portray these women as mad or manipulated. But it is more complex. In a society where women had very little power, the Circumcellion movement offered something radical, spiritual agency. A peasant woman, without a voice in the church, without property, without legal rights, could become a martyr saint, a venerated heroine. Death became emancipation. There is an account of a woman named Maximilla who led a group of female Circumcellions. They attacked a Catholic church during a service, destroyed the altar, and challenged the bishop to condemn them to death. When he refused, they began breaking sacred objects until guards intervened. Several died in the clash. Maximilla survived, but was publicly executed days later. Witnesses reported that she sang until her last breath. Entire families were also consumed by the fever of martyrdom. There are documented cases of fathers who, convinced that the end times were near, and that martyrdom would guarantee eternal salvation, took wives and children into suicidal confrontations with authorities. Children were found dead in sites of collective martyrdom, places where groups of Circumcellions gathered to provoke their own execution. These events raised terrible ethical questions. To what extent was this genuine faith? To what extent was it psychological manipulation, collective hysteria, socioeconomic despair disguised as theology? The truth is probably a mixture of all of this. The Circumcellions lived in conditions of extreme misery, under a system that crushed them. The promise that death would free and glorify them was too powerful to resist. The Catholic Church tried to argue rationally against religious suicide. St. Augustine wrote entire treatises on why life was sacred, why suicide was a sin, why provoking one's own death was not true martyrdom. But rational words have little power against existential despair. For someone whose life is hunger, debt, and oppression, the promise of immediate paradise through death is an irresistible temptation. St. Augustine of Hippo is one of the most important figures in Christian history. Brilliant theologian, profound philosopher, influential bishop. But he was also a man who lived in the midst of the Circumcellion crisis, and much of his work was shaped by this conflict. Augustine was not just a distant observer. He was on the front lines, debating Donatists, writing against voluntary martyrdom, and eventually supporting the use of imperial force to suppress the heresy. Augustine was born in Numidia in 354 AD, in the heart of Donatist territory. His mother, Monica, was a devout Christian. He grew up seeing the division between Catholics and Donatists tear communities apart. When he became Bishop of Hippo in 395 AD, he inherited a besieged diocese. Catholic churches were attacked, priests were beaten, and the Circumcellions were the spearhead of this violence. In the early years, Augustine tried persuasion. He wrote letters, organized public debates, appealed to reason and scripture. He argued that true martyrdom was passive, not provoked. He cited Jesus, who did not seek death, but accepted it when inevitable. He cited Paul, who fled persecutors when possible. Martyrdom, Augustine said, was about witness, not suicide. But the Donatists were not interested in debates. To them, Augustine was a traitor, collaborator with the empire, a false Christian. They ridiculed him, threatened him, and on at least one occasion, almost killed him. A group of Circumcellions ambushed his carriage on a road. He only survived because the guide missed the path, and they took a different route. That incident changed Augustine. He began to argue that heresy was not just theological error, it was a public danger, and the state had a duty to protect citizens, including using force. This position was controversial in among Catholics. Many Christians still remembered Roman persecutions and feared giving the state power over matters of faith. But Augustine insisted. The Donatists were not innocent martyrs. They were violent aggressors, and their violence needed to be contained. In 405 AD, Emperor Honorius issued an edict declaring Donatism illegal. Donatist churches were confiscated, bishops were exiled, meetings were banned, and soldiers were authorized to enforce the law. Augustine supported these measures. He justified religious coercion with an analogy. Just as a father disciplines a rebellious son out of love, the state should discipline heretics to save them. This logic would have terrible consequences in subsequent centuries, justifying inquisitions and persecutions. But in Augustine's mind, it was the only solution. Imperial repression against the Donatists and Circumcellions was brutal. It was not a surgical operation. It was a campaign of state terror, where the line between justice and massacre often disappeared. Roman soldiers, many of whom were not Christians or did not understand theological nuances, were unleashed on villages and cities with orders to suppress heresy. The result was predictable: indiscriminate violence. Donatist churches were raided during services. Entire congregations were arrested. Bishops were dragged from their pulpits, publicly beaten, exiled to remote regions of the empire. Properties were confiscated, books were burned, and any resistance was crushed with lethal force. For the Donatists, this confirmed everything they believed. The Catholic Church had allied with worldly power, betraying Christ. The Circumcellions responded with more violence. Attacks on Catholic churches intensified. Priests were murdered. There were attempts to burn basilicas with the faithful inside. The spiral of violence seemed unstoppable. Every Circumcellion attack justified more imperial repression. Every repression created more martyrs, fueling the movement. It was a vicious cycle that bled North Africa for decades. But the repression had an effect. Slowly, painfully, the Donatist movement was suffocated. Without churches, without bishops, without organizational structure, it began to fragment. The Circumcellions, without institutional support, became isolated bands, increasingly desperate. Some surrendered, others fled to remote mountainous regions. Many died, exactly as they wished, but now without the glory and veneration of a community to celebrate them. In 411 AD, a great council was convened in Carthage. Catholic and Donatist bishops were forced to debate publicly under imperial supervision. The result was predetermined. The Donatists were declared heretics. Their ordinations were invalidated. Their sacraments were rejected. And those who refused to submit to the Catholic Church were exiled or imprisoned. It was the final blow. But the Catholic victory came at a cost. The violence of the repression left deep scars. Many African Christians, even Catholics, were disillusioned with the church that used soldiers to impose doctrine. And when, a century later, the Germanic Vandals invaded North Africa, followed by Muslims in the 7th century, African Christianity collapsed with surprising speed. Some historians argue that the Donatist division and the brutality of the repression fatally weakened the Christian faith in the region. The Circumcellions did not disappear overnight. There was no final battle, no last epic confrontation. They simply dissolved, slowly, over the course of the 5th century. The combination of imperial repression, the disintegration of institutional Donatism, and socio-economic changes made them unsustainable. But their legacy continued to haunt Christian memory. The last reports of Circumcellion activity date to the mid-5th century. Small groups were still reported attacking villages, provoking authorities, seeking martyrdom. But they were shadows of the movement that had terrorized Africa a century earlier. Without an organized theology, without bishops to legitimize them, without communities to venerate them, voluntary martyrdom lost its meaning. Dying without witnesses, without celebration, without memory, is just dying. The Vandal invasion of 429 AD changed everything. The Vandals were Arian Christians, another heresy in the eyes of Catholics and Donatists. They conquered North Africa quickly and imposed their own version of Christianity. Both Catholics and Donatists were persecuted. Ironically, some Donatists initially saw the Vandals as liberators, as divine punishment against the oppressive Catholic Church. But the Vandals made no distinctions. They persecuted everyone who disagreed with them. Under Vandal rule, the old divisions between Catholics and Donatists began to seem irrelevant. Both faced a common enemy. Slowly, the communities began to merge. When the Byzantine Empire reconquered North Africa in 533 AD, Donatism was already practically extinct, and the Circumcellions were just a memory, preserved in the writings of their enemies. But what a memory! Catholic writers, especially Augustine, Optatus of Milevis, and others, recorded the Circumcellions with horror and fascination. They portrayed them as madmen, fanatics, religious terrorists. And that is the image that survived. There are no Circumcellion texts. There are no letters, sermons, or justifications written by themselves. Everything we know comes from their enemies. It is like trying to understand a war by listening to only one side. This raises a crucial question. How accurate are these accounts? Were the Circumcellions really as extreme as described? Or were they exaggerated, demonized, transformed into monsters to justify repression? The truth, probably lies in the middle. It is likely there were Circumcellions genuinely convinced of their theology of martyrdom, but it is also likely there were opportunists, criminals, desperate people using religion as an excuse. And it is certain that Catholic writers had every interest in portraying them in the worst possible light. Looking at the Circumcellions from a distance of 17 centuries, it is easy to condemn them as mad. But if we are honest, their theology wasn't invented out of thin air. It was a logical, albeit extreme, extension of mainstream Christian beliefs. Early Christianity venerated martyrs. The blood of the martyrs was considered the seed of the church. Dying for the faith was the highest honor. So, where exactly did the Circumcellions go wrong? The answer, for theologians like Augustine, lay in intention and provocation. True martyrdom, they argued, was passive. It was accepting death when imposed by unjust persecutors, not actively seeking it. Jesus did not seek the cross. He accepted it when inevitable. The apostles fled when they could, and only died when captured. Actively seeking death, provoking it, forcing it, was subverting the meaning of martyrdom. It was turning witness into suicide. But the Circumcellions could counter-argue. What about the martyrs who voluntarily surrendered to the authorities, and those who refused to sacrifice to Roman gods, knowing it meant certain death? Were they not, in a sense, choosing death? The line between passive and active martyrdom is blurrier than it seems. And in a culture that glorified martyrs, that told their stories with admiration, that venerated their relics, it was inevitable that some would take this logic to the extreme. There is also a socio-economic dimension that cannot be ignored. The Circumcellions were, for the most part, the poorest of the poor. They lived in a society that crushed them, that offered them no hope, that treated them as disposable. In this context, the promise that death would transform them into heroes, into saints, into equals with the rich and powerful in heaven, was powerful. Martyrdom was, in a sense, the only form of social mobility available. This does not excuse the violence. It does not justify attacking innocents, terrorizing communities, destroying lives. But it contextualizes. The Circumcellions were not incomprehensible monsters. They were desperate human beings who found, in a distorted theology, an exit from unbearable suffering. And the society that created them with its brutal exploitation, its obscene inequality, its indifference to the suffering of the poor bears its share of the blame. The question remains, could it happen again? In a world where religious extremism still exists, where socioeconomic despair still pushes people toward radical ideologies, where the promise of glory after death still attracts the hopeless, the answer is disturbingly clear. Yes, and in many places, it is happening. The Circumcellions are a historical warning we ignore at our own peril. The Circumcellions disappeared from history, but their impact reverberated for centuries. The way the Catholic Church dealt with them established dangerous precedents. Augustine, by justifying the use of state force against heretics, opened a door that would never close again. His logic that the state can coerce in matters of faith, that heresy is a public crime, that violence can be used to save souls would be used to justify the Inquisition, the Crusades, the religious wars of the Reformation. This does not mean Augustine was wrong about everything. He was facing a real crisis. The Circumcellions were violent. People were dying. Communities were being terrorized. Something needed to be done. But the solution he endorsed: violent repression, religious coercion. The alliance between church and sword had consequences he could not foresee. Centuries later, when the church burned heretics at the stake, it cited Augustine as justification. The Circumcellions also force us to confront uncomfortable questions about martyrdom. Christianity, from the beginning, glorified martyrs, but in doing so, it created a perverse incentive. If the greatest honor is to die for the faith, then living becomes, in a sense, a failure. If martyrs are instant saints, then why not seek martyrdom? The Church tried to create distinctions: true versus false martyrdom, passive versus active, but these lines are hard to maintain when the culture is saturated with veneration for those who died. There is also the question of historical silence. Why do so few people know about the Circumcellions? Why is this story not taught? Part of the answer is simple: they lost. History is written by the victors, and the victors, in this case, had every interest in minimizing, distorting, or forgetting the Circumcellions. They were an embarrassment, a stain on the triumphalist narrative of Christianity. But there is another reason. The Circumcellions ask us questions we prefer not to answer, about the nature of faith and fanaticism, about the line between martyrdom and suicide, about what happens when religion mixes with despair, about the responsibility of church and state when people are pushed to extremism. These questions are hard, and the answers are complex. It is easier to forget, but forgetting is dangerous, because the patterns that created the Circumcellions' brutal inequality, misunderstood theology, glorification of death, absence of hope still exist. In different forms, in different places, but they exist. And as long as they exist, the risk of new Circumcellions emerging remains. We have reached the end of this disturbing journey, but before closing, we must confront the most uncomfortable truth the Circumcellions reveal. Faith, when divorced from reason, compassion, and earthly hope, can become destructive, not just to others, but to the believers themselves. The Circumcellions were not monsters. They were sincere believers who took their faith to the most extreme conclusions. And that should scare us. Early Christianity had a complex relationship with death. On one hand, it taught that life was sacred, that suicide was a sin, that believers should live as witnesses of Christ in the world. On the other, it glorified those who died for the faith, who chose death rather than deny Christ, who saw earthly life as mere preparation for eternity. These two emphases coexisted in tension, and in places like North Africa in the 4th century, where life was especially brutal, this tension snapped. The Circumcellions are a reminder that religion is not automatically beneficial. It can be. It can inspire compassion, justice, selfless sacrifice. But it can also be distorted, used to justify violence, manipulated to control the desperate. The difference lies not in the faith itself, but in how it is taught, practiced, contextualized. A faith that offers only heavenly promises, without earthly hope, creates Circumcellions. A faith that glorifies death without valuing life creates suicidal martyrs. The Catholic Church eventually learned this lesson, albeit painfully. In the following centuries, it developed a more balanced theology of martyrdom, emphasizing that life is a gift from God, that suicide is always wrong, that true Christian witness is living, not just dying well. But this lesson came too late for the Circumcellions, and it cost thousands of lives. Today, in a world where religious extremism still kills, where promises of paradise still attract suicide bombers, where despair still pushes people toward destructive ideologies, the Circumcellions are not just ancient history. They are a warning. They are a mirror. They are a prophecy. They show us what happens when faith becomes fanaticism, when theology ignores humanity, when the church fails to offer real hope. But they also show us something else. That people who fall into extremism are not inherently evil. They are, frequently, the most desperate, the most wounded, the ones society has abandoned. The Circumcellions were starving peasants, freed slaves with no future, people for whom life was so unbearable that death seemed like liberation. If we want to prevent new Circumcellions from emerging, it is not enough to condemn their theology. We need to change the conditions that created them. The story of the Circumcellions ended over 1500 years ago, but the questions they raise remain. What should we do when faith becomes destructive? How do we balance religious freedom with public safety? What is the responsibility of organized religion when its teachings are distorted? And most importantly, how do we create a society where no one sees death as the only exit? These questions have no easy answers, but ignoring them is guaranteeing that tragedy repeats itself. The Circumcellions died seeking heaven. They left behind a hell of violence, division, and pain. May their story, finally told, teach us to build a world where faith inspires life, not death, where hope is found not just in the hereafter, where no one needs to die to feel important. And with that, we end this journey through the shadows of Christian history. If this story impacted you, if it made you think, if it challenged you, share this video. Because stories like this need to be told, truths like this need to be known, and questions like these need to be asked. Until the next historical revelation.